basis. And I like to give the example of perhaps the perfect execution of this, which was in Iraq when Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed by U.S. forces in 2007, I believe it was. 2006, excuse me, because I was still Director of National Intelligence. It was 2006. And his telephone was discovered by human intelligence. His whereabouts then were tracked through the interception of those telephone calls, and then it was geospatial intelligence, drones, and so forth that permitted our forces to ultimately geolocate Mr. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. So that's an example. And another point to make about that, it's very important to have all those kinds of intelligence collection assets, particularly when you're talking about battlefield and troop support situations, as far forward into the battle space as possible. I worked on budget. The President announced that I was going to be in charge of the budget when he announced my nomination. And I worked on human relations, on the whole question of human resources and personnel types of issues. I think those are two areas where probably the Director of National Intelligence still needs more authority, because you may recall that when the issue of intelligence reform was debated, the question of the extent of authority of the Director of National Intelligence was controversial, and there were the existing agencies who wanted to protect existing authorities and existing ways of doing things, and they didn't really necessarily appreciate the idea of this new office coming into play a kind of an oversight role. So there were ambiguities in some of the authorities given to the Director of National Intelligence, and I would say probably the most important ones were in the area of budget and human resource issues, where I think for example, authority to hire and fire, and greater authority to set budgets for the intelligence community, I think would be something that would be useful in making the Director of National Intelligence more effective going forward. Another thing I felt as a consequence of my time in the Directorate of National Intelligence was that, and this, I don't know whether this is just unrealistic or not, but I was struck when I came back to Washington from Iraq, and I went to one of the dinners, I think it was a White House Correspondents' Dinner, when I was first getting into this job, and I must have met 20 or 30 correspondents who told me they covered intelligence on a full-time basis, and it kind of shocked me that there would be so much information publicly available about intelligence matters that we could occupy so many journalists in Washington on the subject. But apparently we were, and I just think that maybe as a nation we need maybe to stand back and think about this a bit and wonder whether we need to try to lower the profile of intelligence issues a little bit and make it a little bit lower key, because invariably what happens with intelligence, if it does get publicity, it's invariably controversial because you can never have the full picture in any public discussion. So people sort of zero in on things that they then proceed to try and make controversial. And in that same connection, I think that one takeaway of my experience as DNI was I think that we need to focus more on the professionalization of the top leadership of the intelligence community. I think one thing that ought to be seriously considered is making the Director of National Intelligence, possibly the Director of the CIA as well, 10-year appointments, the way we do with the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And perhaps that would encourage a somewhat less political approach to the job. And frankly, I think that's one of the most important things we could do. But basically, my bottom line would be that there has been progress towards improving analysis and integrating intelligence since 9/11 and since the intelligence reform. There's always can be improvements, and I think there is a ways to go yet. but we're on a good path. And as far as our safety from external attack, from a recurrence of the kind of terrorist attacks that occurred in 9/11, I think that the country is safer than it was back in September of 2001. Thank you.
Ambassador Negroponte, thank you very much for that. Can you hear me in the back? When most current or former intelligence officials inquire as to whether a session is on the record and the answer is yes, I usually brace myself to hear something like the teacher in Charlie Brown, but you avoided that by a mile, and we thank you for it. Thank you, Dr. Schwab, for the invitation to the four of us to join you this evening on this panel, and thanks to everyone for attending. Those of us who grew up speaking on military radios were trained never to sacrifice clarity for brevity. But I think good advice for any moderator is not to sacrifice brevity for clarity. So I'm going to keep my comments here very quick and instead yield the floor to my colleagues and then to questions, since I know we have a lot of expertise here in the room. Let me just say one thing right off the bat. The four of us are affiliated with the same organization, the Center for a New American Security in Washington, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national security and defense policy think tank. We don't take institutional views. You're not getting the party line here. I really have no idea what my colleagues are going to say. There's some...
And neither do we.
And there's some significant chance that we're going to disagree with one another. So I want to make sure you understand that. We as an organization took our first real foray into the intelligence field just after Christmas of last year, when we got a note from Major General Michael Flynn, the serving senior intelligence officer in Afghanistan, who said that he was looking for an outlet to publish a memo on the role of intelligence and the practice of intelligence on the battlefield in Afghanistan. That didn't strike me as particularly unusual, and then he sent the draft. And what we read was a pretty scathing indictment of the way tactical and operational intelligence operations in Afghanistan were being conducted. And it was scathing enough that we went back to him and said, "Hey, General, this is really admirable, but are you sure that you want to go public with this through a think tank first? Might this be an internal memo rather than a public document?" He was adamant. He said that he had, in his estimation, a year to turn the situation on the ground around, and he had a message that he wanted to get out. I'm going to quote from his report two quick pieces. First, in a recent project ordered by the White House, analysts could barely scrape together enough information to formulate rudimentary assessments of pivotal Afghan districts. It's little wonder, then, that many decision makers rely more upon newspapers than military intelligence to obtain ground truth. This is from the serving senior intelligence officer in Afghanistan. His second quote: "The format of intelligence products matters. Commanders who think PowerPoint storyboards and color-coded spreadsheets are adequate for describing the Afghan conflict and its complexities have some soul-searching to do. Sufficient knowledge will not come from slides with little more text than a comic strip. Commanders must demand